It's a great pleasure to welcome Alain de Botton to the AA. Alain's talk tonight is in conjunction with an exhibition that we have upstairs. And the exhibition relates to a travel scholarship that exists under the name of Peter Sabara. Peter Sabara was a wonderful student here many years ago. He died when he was very young, and he used to teach here and at Royal College. And his family then set up this travel fellowship, which is given every year between the students of the AA and the students of the RCA. And this year, the winners have been Jonathan Nicos and Joseph Prima, who are here sitting. Two students in the diploma school at the AA. Normally, when we have the Peter Sabara travel fellowships, people submit proposals that are very, very complex, very detailed. And for example, the last one was fantastic kind of explorations along the Silk Route. So then the idea of kind of the actual route became such a critical part of it. Jonathan and Joseph went completely the opposite way by trying not to have a very clear destination and letting themselves be open to the possibility of kind of discovering places. So the photographs upstairs document this, and I think if you haven't seen them, I would really urge you to have a look at them because they're great. And after seeing the photographs and the proposal, I think it dawned to Vanessa Norwood, who coordinates and is in charge of exhibitions here, that in fact Alain was the person who had also written very eloquently on this topic. And in fact, Joseph and Jonathan were not the first people to come up with the idea of not having a destination. But I think then that set up the possibility of this conversation between their photographs and Alain's work on travel. Alain de Botton has been really one of the most influential figures in contemporary literature, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, where his The Consolations of Philosophy book has probably played a very, very significant role in bringing philosophy to a much wider audience than it has been historically. And of course, his more recent book, The Art of Travel, has received enormous attention. He has recently finished a book entitled Status Anxiety, which is on social hierarchies in the West, and is working on a book on interiors, which I think would be of great relevance to a lot of us. So without further delay, please welcome Alain de Botton.
Well, it's a huge pleasure for me to be here. I much enjoyed looking at the exhibition upstairs, and if any of you haven't seen it, it really is well worth seeing, and almost uncanny in the way that it's picked up on things that I was interested in already, so it just shows that we're all roughly thinking the same things. Tonight I want to talk about travel, but I wrote this book called The Art of Travel, but really it's not about travel because travel doesn't really interest me. What interests me is places. And when I was writing this book, I always thought to myself, my sort of secret ideology was that this really was a book just about places and their power and their effect on us. And the word travel was simply a good hold-all in which to contain all of these ideas that I didn't really know where they belonged, and then just thought of sticking the word travel on the jacket, which got me into a lot of trouble with certain reviewers who kept saying, you know, where's the bit about your year off when you go traveling, and where's the bit about losing your luggage, etc. And so it really is a very selective journey through travel, and the emphasis, and I'm saying this to you because of where we are tonight, is really on places and the power of places and the emotions that we can have in certain places. And it did seem to me when writing this book that this is a sort of an area of life which doesn't really quite have a genre. It's a little bit travel, it could be architectural, landscape writing, I don't know what it is. But anyway, so a weird book. And The Art of Travel was designed really to to be a chance for me to think about that and pin down some of my thoughts. I should probably say that before writing this book a few years ago, I wrote a book called How Proust Can Change Your Life, although when the book was originally written, it was called How Proust Will Change Your Life. And then I remember sending the book to my American editor, and he read it, and then a few days later he called me back and he said, we will publish the book, but we do insist on a change to the title because our in-house lawyer has read the book, and apparently in certain American states you can be sued if you make a promise that isn't then fulfilled. So we have to change it to How Proust Can Change Your Life. I'm saying this just in case what I'm going to say is a complete disappointment and gibberish. Please don't sue me. But anyway, what I think I'll do is I'll dip into a number of chapters, a number of themes that crop up in my book, and then hopefully we have a chance to talk and have questions and answers and all that. One of the first topics that I look at is the whole business of the difference between anticipating a place and being in a place, and all sorts of themes crop up in that. It's an experience that's really at the heart of any desire to travel. Travel at its most basic is based on the idea that by moving from point A to point B, your mood will in some way improve. There will be some kind of increase in happiness, putting it very crudely, from point A to point B. It's also very true that the desire to go to a place can arise with very, very minimal knowledge of what that place is actually like. Just as in love, the capacity to fall in love is entirely, particularly in men, unrelated to any knowledge we may have of the person we might be falling in love with. Psychoanalysts would say that there's a lot of projection going on here. Essentially that we're filling in the blanks, and we're putting into those blanks things that we want to believe are true. In my book, I relate a journey that I made to the island of Barbados, and really try and track in minute detail the desire and the realization of this desire and sort of the difference between the two. And I relate how on one January day, this is now a few years ago, I was sitting at home and a brochure, it had been a particularly miserable winter, and a brochure came through the door, unsolicited, called Winter Sun. And I think most of us are feeling that after a few months of British winter, if someone shows you a brochure called Winter Sun, something starts to happen that you almost can't control. You want to go there. And as I was looking at pictures of these Winter Sun places, and I include a picture in the book that I got from this guide, this brochure, picture, you can't really see it, but anyway, it's a picture of sort of a beach, and it's the typical azure sky and the sand and the palm tree, etc. It's the classic beach shot. And I've seen these beach shots so often, and I keep telling myself that there is some problem associated with it. But every time I see one, I still want to go there. As I look at this picture now, I actually do believe, as I believed a few years ago, that if only I could be there, I would be happy. And it's I'm really trying to explore, it is extraordinary, the power of images and sort of imaginary places. So I booked a holiday, went off to Barbados, and tried to record very minutely the difference between what I'd imagined it might be like and what the reality was like. And one of the sort of crudest but most major observations is that when you look at a picture of a place like this, a very basic thing that one's likely to forget is that you're going to actually have to be there. You're not just going to be enjoying the palm trees and the blue sky and the clouds, but you will be in that scene. And by emphasizing the you, really what I'm trying to point to is a whole welter of anxieties, regrets, fears, all the kinds of things that make living with oneself day to day difficult. All of these things will accompany one to the destination. And this is, of course, something that travel agents are particularly unsympathetic about. If you went to Thomas Cook and said, I'd like to go somewhere else, but not with myself, they would call the police. So it's just something that it's a very basic sort of perceptual error, and we keep forgetting it. And I think it strikes us again and again. We simply often cannot imagine ourselves in the scene. And I say that, I conclude at one point, I say that in order to get a more accurate sense of what it's like to be in a place, you shouldn't just look at a picture for a second. What you should do is probably stare at a picture for about 20 minutes. Force yourself to stare at 20 minutes. And then you'll get a much clearer sense, because if you have to look at anything for 20 minutes, what immediately starts to happen is that other thoughts start to intrude, thoughts that come between you and the thing you're looking at. You might remember some anxiety, some worry, you might be hungry, you might be thirsty. A whole welter of things might happen that, again, would sort of come between you and the experience. So I think a lot of the reason why we're distracted and confused by images is the way that we just take in one glimpse, and in one glimpse this is only a very, very partial sense of what will actually happen. I end the chapter by looking at one of the stranger characters of French literature, a character called the Duc des Esseintes, who comes up in Huysmans' novel À rebours, Against Nature, and he develops a rather distinctive attitude to travelling. For those of you who haven't read it, there's a section where one day this character des Esseintes, he lives in a huge villa outside Paris, and one day he decides that he'd like to go to England because he's read some Dickens and he's been very moved by some of the descriptions of London. He's also dipped into Baedecker's Guide to London, and he's developed all these fantasies about what it'd be like to walk in Green Park and to visit the National Gallery, etc. So he's got a whole host of fantasies, and one day he decides, I really will head off to England. So he buys his ticket, heads off to Paris, goes to the Gare du Nord, and as he's about to get on the train with his 16 pieces of luggage, he travels very heavily, he suddenly thinks, oh my God, I've already enjoyed the best parts of my journey to England from my own home. So he gets the porter to take all the luggage right off the train again and heads off back to his villa and decides that, in fact, he will never travel again. Instead, what he will do is to dedicate in his large villa one room to the subject of travel. And so he decks out this room with all the kinds of things that can inspire reveries of travel. He hangs in this room a series of timetables of the major shipping lines and train lines. He gets a jar of seawater and occasionally undoes his jar of seawater to smell the smell of the sea. He gets a large sail and occasionally flaps the sail around so as to evoke the sounds of a sea journey. And anyway, so that's the most extreme conclusion one might come to. I myself don't go that far, but there are indeed moments when one can think that a flick through something like the British Airways worldwide timetable can be more rewarding than the actual journey. For those of you who haven't ever looked through the British Airways worldwide timetable, it is a wonderful document. Lists all the destinations, and I mean, it truly is very, very inspiring. There's another chapter in this book that I rarely talk about, but in this company I think I am going to have a go, because it's all about the architecture and the feeling of what I describe as travelling places, places that we really go to only when we're travelling. They're kind of in-between places. They're places like motels, diners, airports, train stations, and like many people, probably like many of you in this room, but not many, I mean, this is a sort of slightly selective choice. I think these places, despite their sort of formal architectural poverty, one could say, they nevertheless have a real hold on us. And I really tried to explore, why do I love going to service stations so much? That was the sort of motor behind this chapter. And I tried to explore this from many different angles. And one of the ideas that I came up with was that there are places where no one is really at home, and if you're someone who doesn't feel quite at home when you're supposed to be at home, there is a kind of relief in the anonymity and the transience of certain places, and I think that's what does explain the hold that some of these places have. It's rather like listening to a very sad piece of music when you're feeling sad. It can be the best thing. It's not necessarily by being in a very homely place that you can necessarily feel at home if other things are not going right. So it's really, I was really trying to think about the way that a certain degree of, one could say, alienation can actually help one to feel a sense of community. We hear so much about the architecture of community, etc., and there is a weird way in which a lonely service station might oddly have more of a sense of community because it's the community of fellow lonely souls. So I definitely recommend to anyone who's feeling lonely, there's nothing quite beats an evening in a happy eater on the roadside. And I explore this through that great artist of these lonely places, Edward Hopper, who seemed very alive to this. I also try and describe the beauty of taking an aeroplane, because the modes of modern transport are hugely interesting to me. Again, this is something that's very often spoken about either not at all or else through technology. So when people talk about the beauty of flying or taking a train, often that conversation gets diverted to the impressiveness of the aeroplane, etc. And I try to describe it really from a more sort of aesthetic point of view. I am aware that there does tend to be a kind of gender issue on this. I think if you're sitting next to almost any man in an aeroplane and the aeroplane's taxiing somewhere and you say, that's a 777 out the window or an A310, most men will understand that you're talking about new generations of Boeings and Airbuses, but most women will look quite puzzled and bored. Although I made this extremely sexist and completely false remark the other day in a lecture I was giving, and someone stood up at the end and said that, a woman stood up and said that she was a pilot for British Airways, and she knew a hell of a lot more about travelling than I did. So I must apologise if I am... but anyway, I think that there can be a sort of a slight gender thing, which I think is unfairly can be an unfair block to an appreciation of the sort of the aesthetic dimension of flying. Let me read you a little bit about flying and the pleasures of it. I say that few seconds in life are more releasing than those in which a plane ascends to the sky. Again, for some people. Looking out of a window from inside a machine standing stationary at the beginning of a runway, we face a vista of familiar proportions: a road, oil cylinders, grass, and hotels with copper-tinted windows. The earth as we've always known it, where we make slow progress, even with the help of a car, where calf muscles and engines strain to reach the summit of hills, where half a mile ahead or less, there's almost always a line of trees or buildings to restrict our view. Then, suddenly, accompanied by the controlled rage of the engines, with only a slight tremor from glasses in the galley, we rise fluently into the atmosphere, and an immense horizon opens up across which we can wander without impediment. A journey which on Earth would have taken an afternoon can be accomplished with an infinitesimal movement of the eye. We can cross Berkshire, visit Maidenhead, skirt over Bracknell, and survey the whole of the M4. There's psychological pleasure in this takeoff too, for the swiftness of the plane's ascent is an exemplary symbol of all kinds of transformation. The display of power can inspire us to imagine analogous, decisive shifts in our own lives, to imagine that we too might one day surge above much that now looms over us. The new vantage point lends order and logic to the landscape. Roads curve to avoid hills, rivers trace paths to lakes, pylons lead from power stations to towns, streets that from the earth seem laid out without thought emerge as well-planned grids. The engines show none of the effort required to take us to this place. They hang in the inconceivable cold, patiently and invisibly powering the craft, their sole requests painted on their inner flanks in red letters, being that we not walk on them and feed them oil only D50 TFI-S4, a message for a forthcoming set of men in overalls 4,000 miles away and still asleep. There isn't much talk about the clouds visible up here. No one seems to think it remarkable that somewhere above an ocean we're flying past a vast white candy floss island, which would have made a perfect seat for an angel or even God himself in a painting by Piero della Francesca. In the cabin, no one stands up to announce with requisite emphasis that out of the window we are flying over a cloud, a matter that would certainly have detained Leonardo and Poussin, Claude and Constable. Anyway, I'll stop it there, but that's some of my enthusiasm for flying and trains, which is part of this book. Moving on now to another chapter where I discuss the theme of what I call the exotic, because it seems that one of the qualities that we look for when we travel abroad is a quality that could be defined as the exotic. The exotic is, of course, something that's had a rather bad name. It's often associated with a kind of romantic fantasy of something that it seems exotic to an outsider but isn't in fact so at all, etc. But nevertheless, I wanted to try and recover some of the positive associations in that word, and also to try and loosen us from this kind of almost this very modern obsession with the idea of getting a place right. Because of many people have got places wrong, there's an idea that it's always bad to have an idea of a place that perhaps is selective. So I was trying to challenge a little bit that idea that all selectiveness when viewing places is bad and is false, and trying to make a case almost for personal enthusiasms when it comes to certain places. I try to analyse, well, what does make a place exotic? At one level, it's because it's different, but that clearly doesn't seem enough because lots of places are different that we don't find exotic. And I think it's really it really needs to be a place which is both different and also lovable in some way, that a place contains something that we long for and feel attracted to, but perhaps don't have so much in our own environment. And I think there's almost a comparison to be made here with the way that we find certain people lovable, desirable, exotic, sexually attractive. I think the process is kind of a little bit analogous. There are ways in which we can often fall in love with people because they have qualities that we admire but don't possess, and it's the recognition of these qualities that draws us to them. In case this seems kind of hopelessly abstract, I remember feeling a great amount of love for my girlfriend one night when we'd been invited to a party, and suddenly we were driving, we were already quite late, and suddenly we got a flat tyre, and I rather panicked because I'm not so good on the mechanical side of life, and I didn't know what to do. I suggested calling the police, and she said, "No, don't be ridiculous, we'll just get the back tyre out of the boot." So she, in full evening party gear, got out this back tyre, winching up the car, and was just changing, had the wheel on and off again in just a few minutes. And as I was watching this process, I felt, well, this is why I love her, because she's able to change a tyre. And I think, similarly, I think sometimes she feels that when she sees me lying around with lots of books, reading lots of books. She likes the idea that someone in the house is doing a lot of reading, even though she herself doesn't get much of a chance. So, we balance each other out. And I think that can be a feature of romantic relationships, and also of our attraction to countries. If we think about the way that Germans, there's such a long history of Germans falling in love with Italy, and to make it sort of very crude, there are qualities that Germans have that Italians don't, and vice versa. And I think that if one reads the sort of journeys of someone like Goethe and the sense of what that journey to Italy meant to Goethe, you get a sense really that he was finding in Italy qualities that he admired and needed in order to be a sort of rounded human being, but couldn't find enough of in Germany. And of course, this shows huge variation. I mean, we have this idea that an exotic country, if you say to an average Northern European or Northern American, the exotic, what images come to mind? Often it will be things like the Middle East. And the reason for that is the huge literature on the Middle East, and the whole 19th century romantic emphasis on the Middle East as the source of the exotic. Although that really doesn't have to be. I mean, I remember I made a trip to Egypt a few years ago, and I remember flying back from Cairo, and I was chatting next to this Egyptian man, and as we were coming down towards London, it was an August day, and London was covered in very, very thick grey cloud, and it was pouring with rain. And I turned to this man and I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, this is pretty grim." And he went, No, this is so exotic. And I thought, of course it is. Of course it's exotic. If what you're looking at on most of the time is the desert. So, the word exotic is a very mobile one, and I think you can gain a very interesting understanding of someone by saying, what is the country that you find exotic? Because it is something that very much varies, and that tells us a lot about someone's sort of internal geography. So that was something I was trying to explore. Another issue that sort of often comes up in travel and in other things too, obviously, but I was looking at this through travel, is the theme of curiosity. And traveling is generally, being in a foreign place is an experience that demands a lot of curiosity. There's a kind of an expectation, really, that we will be very curious of the place that we're in. If you read the average guidebook to the average city, it tells you to go and see 5 museums, 16 buildings, 12 shopping arcades, 5 fountains, etc. A whole list of things that you should, if you're a good person, go and want to see. Though, of course, I think what can often happen is a kind of collapse of curiosity. And I sort of describe being in a hotel. I was invited to Madrid a few years ago, and friends had told me how wonderful. I'd never been to Madrid. Friends told me how wonderful Madrid was, and a friend had even lent me a guidebook. And as I was sitting in my hotel, I felt a kind of despair, and I almost wanted to start crying and return home because I didn't want to see anything. I just wanted to be at home, really. And I felt a complete absence of curiosity and a great sort of sense of guilt because of that. And I think that proper curiosity, how one becomes properly curious about places rather than simply obedient to the demands of a tourist schedule, takes us right to the heart of education and really a sense of what it means to feel sort of alive intellectually, properly alive, rather than sort of obediently alive. And I think that on the whole, travelling does set up quite unrealistic expectations. To be properly curious about things takes an awfully long time. It often demands a whole background, a whole sort of background of expectation, thought, knowledge, etc., which we simply don't have the chance to build up. And part of the problem is that geography is a very unhelpful way of guiding our curiosity. If you're a tourist in London, this part of London, in a way, there are supposedly many, many things to be curious about. You should go to the British Museum, you should admire the Georgian architecture, you might go and look at the shopping streets of the shops of Oxford Street, etc. So there are a whole host of things that you need to do. But of course, to be properly observant of, let's say, Georgian architecture might require that one actually skirt the British Museum altogether and head off for, let's say, the squares of Islington or whatever it happens to be. So geography can set up a very unhelpful system of expectation of what we should be interested in. It's rather like if you were forced to read a selection of books for a university course, simply according to how books were sized or the colours of their spines. There's a kind of arbitrary quality to the way that the tourist schedule is built up. And so that's something I think that is sort of worth exploring and feeling perhaps less guilty about. I don't know. Moving on now, I'm really skipping through just to give you a sort of sense of some of the ideas I was playing with, and there is a lot more in the book itself. Another thing I wanted to look at, and I was chewing off some rather large questions, because there's a chapter here called On the Country and the City, and the large question at the heart of this is, what's so nice about the countryside? Which really is a big question, and I can't really confess that I answered it completely in 20 pages, but I was really trying to address at least some aspects of what is it that draws people to the countryside. And I got some help from this from William Wordsworth, who I always thought was an extraordinarily dull poet until I started to explore him more deeply and to read him properly. And Wordsworth really had some fascinating thoughts about why it is that the countryside has a sort of regenerative quality. Nowadays, when we think about the benefits of nature, the answer that tends to be given is very much a sort of physical one, that nature is good for your body, it's great to breathe clean air, it's healthy. There's a sort of, that's the aerobic answer to the purposes of nature. Or else there's also the ecological answer, which is that nature is a vital resource on which we all depend, etc. And the argument often quickly becomes political, etc. But this wasn't, of course, the way that people in the 19th century would have addressed the question. For them, it was absolutely obvious what nature was for. Nature was good for your soul. Again, nowadays, this is a very unfashionable and strange idea. If you said you're going off to the Lake District for your soul, that would sound very old-fashioned, potentially pretentious, etc. And yet that would have been very much the view of someone like Wordsworth. And I wanted to try and recover some of what he might have been motivated by when he said that. And really, I mean, to boil it horrendously down to a nutshell, I think what Wordsworth saw in nature was a realm independent of human beings, and he believed that cities are very, very bad generators of envy, because it's a fact that when we're surrounded by other people, we quickly compare our condition to theirs, and always think that someone else's advantages are greater than ours, etc. So envy seemed to be very much something that Wordsworth saw as an urban disease, and saw the countryside as a real relief from that, because it's a realm that's independent of man, and that awes man, or should awe man, to withdraw from his or her sort of petty concerns. So there's a sort of in my book I tried to talk about the way in which a feeling of envy might be quelled by looking at a waterfall or a large mountain. I did sort of take Wordsworth almost at his word and try to see what he might be going on about. Let me read you a little bit where I talk about this. I say that there are concerns that seem indecent when one's in the company of a cliff, others to which cliffs naturally lend their assistance, their majesty encouraging the steady and high-minded in ourselves, their size teaching us to respect with good grace and an awed humility all that surpasses us. It is, of course, still possible to feel envy for a colleague before a mighty cataract. It's just, if Wordsworth's message is to be believed, a little more unlikely. Wordsworth argued that through a life spent in nature, his character had been shaped to resist competition, envy, and anxiety. And so he celebrated, these are lines from the prelude, that first I looked at man through objects that were great or fair, first communed with him by their help, and thus was founded a sure safeguard and defence against the weight of meanness, selfish cares, coarse manners, and vulgar passions that beat in on all sides from the ordinary world in which we traffic. So, anyway, there's Wordsworth trying to tell us about why cities why the countryside might be good for envy. Let me sort of skip on now to a couple of chapters where I looked at the impact of art on travel and really our sense of places. And it's a sort of it's a very sort of perhaps well-known but very widely observed fact that the desire to go to places is very easily influenced by our acquaintance with works of art. I think the way that many of us, for example, nowadays respond to the American landscape is completely connected to the way that for the last sort of 60 years, 70 years, so many films have depicted areas of the United States in a particularly attractive light. And so that when we drive down a main street or when we cross the New Mexico desert, we've done so before, we've done so in works of art. And so works of art have sort of opened our eyes to the possible pleasures of a particular kind of aesthetic. And so I think there is a way in which not knowing certain works of art can cut us off or can leave us blind to certain of the pleasures of places. And conversely, it's when we do know certain works of art that we can be initiated to the pleasures of places. I describe all this with a journey that I made to the south of France, to Provence, where I'd never been, but and didn't immediately find much charm. People always go on and on about how nice Provence is. But it was really only after looking at that great stalwart of Provençal artist, Van Gogh, and looking more closely at his work that I began to get a sense of what was particular about the landscape, began to pick up on certain things like the particular quality of cypress trees, the particular quality of the blue in the sky, and other such features which Van Gogh was very, very alive to and draws our own attention to. There's a lovely quote from Oscar Wilde, which I think really captures this idea of how artists sort of initiate us to the pleasures of places. Oscar Wilde said that before James Whistler came to paint the Thames and to paint London, there was no fog in London. Of course, there was fog in London, but we just weren't so good at finding it. And picking up on that idea, one could say that there were far fewer cypress trees in Provence before Van Gogh came along and painted them. So very much this idea that it's through acquaintance with certain works of art. I mean, as architects, we're all the architects are very much used to seeing the way in which one can improve an environment as a task of knocking something down, rebuilding it, redoing it. But anyway, making a sort of intervention. I think that artists sort of often challenge that idea by showing us that really all you might have to do is to sort of adjust your eyesight, as it were, and not necessarily pull anything down. I mentioned very briefly in that chapter the way that the films of Patrick Keeler has made me see a certain sort of beauty and charm to some of the sort of industrial landscapes of the southeast of England that before I'd always seen as just plain ugly. So without knocking anything down, Patrick Keeler has helped me to see something attractive in places. So I think that's a real sort of challenge there. Another theme that I pick up on is the idea of memory and places. If we do manage to have a nice time when we travel, and if we do manage to end up in a place that we like, there can often be very quickly a kind of bittersweet thought that we're about to lose this place, that just in a few hours we're going to be back on the plane, we're going to be back home, we'll soon have forgotten the place, which at the moment seems very, very important to us. So the anxiety of forgetting a place is I think something that we do come across when we travel. Most people start to do some quite peculiar things. Not peculiar, but most people start to do some quite typical things when they feel that anxiety. They pick up the camera, they pick up their video camera, still camera, or else they start buying souvenirs. And in these various ways, picking up the camera, filming something, buying a souvenir, what we're hoping really to try and do, I think, is to preserve an experience. But there is something rather paradoxical about it, because I think we all know the experience of trying to capture something and then returning home. You know, let's say you're in a vulnerable moment in a particularly beautiful place. Let's say you're in Petra. Someone comes up, tries to sell you a miniature carved camel. Sad to lose Petra. You buy the camel. Back home, you look at the camel, and it's just a camel, but where is Petra? And so I think that there is that feeling sometimes that we're trying to pin an experience down, and it flies away. This theme attracted the attention of John Ruskin in the 19th century, and particularly the theme of photography. He was writing just at the dawn of photography and observed the way that people were constantly taking photographs. And at first he was very keen on photographs himself, but gradually grew less and less enchanted with the medium as he saw that photographs encouraged people not to look at the places that they were actually taking photographs of. So that really photography ended up completely being a sort of self-defeating exercise, he felt, for many people. And he came up with this idea that really in order to try and remember anything, we have to make art. And even if, and he stressed again and again, this had nothing to do with making great art. This had to do with appreciation. He believed that in order to try and properly remember and appreciate a place and understand a place, you either have to draw it or else try and describe it in words. And he wrote a couple of books on drawing. He thought it was scandalous that people weren't taught drawing, that they were taught Latin and Greek at school and maths and physics, but they were never taught drawing, or they weren't taught it systematically. And he believed that drawing was as much of a skill that everyone should have as reading and writing. And the reason for this is he felt that drawing is something that very quickly takes us from a general sense of what something or some place is like to a much more specific sense. And there's a very nice description of the way that he asked the reader. He has a rather sort of blunt way of writing, and he tells the reader that he says, I bet you think you know what a tree looks like, but he goes on to say that probably you don't have any idea what a tree looks like because you've never drawn one. And he describes the difference in the way that people imagine trees and what they're actually like. And I had a few goes at drawing trees, and it is true that I didn't know what a tree looked like. I probably still don't know very well, but it's really a very sort of basic but very, I think, important point. The role of a kind of conscious awareness of something, and the way that can help us to truly understand the laws of beauty. And Ruskin talks a lot about the laws of beauty. That can seem a very old-fashioned way of looking at things, but I think really what he meant is to try and be able to describe in words or through drawings why we like places, and to try and develop theories about why it is that we like places. So he was also very keen on a kind of psychological approach to the description of places and buildings. So not just outlining the formal features of things, but also describing in very sort of emotional language why certain buildings move us. And I think that's, for all its flaws, I think the wonderful thing about Ruskin's sort of architectural writing is that idea that it seems that for him buildings and landscapes are almost like people. They are animate things. They have characters. Mountains are strong and sometimes angry, etc. So I think a very fascinating way of looking at the sort of the environment. Just coming now to an end, and really hopefully this ties up with the theme of the exhibition upstairs, because this is all about ordinary life, and this is all about coming home, one could say. It's an interesting feature of travel that when there's almost a sort of dichotomy that abroad is exciting and at home is home is boring. That's almost the sort of the mindset of traveling. That's a justification for traveling. We wouldn't go somewhere else if we didn't in some way have a dissatisfaction with our own environment. But there is a sort of curious feature of this dichotomy, which is, if you imagine the average aeroplane descending towards the average city, half the people on board will be coming home. They'll be thinking, oh no, how sad, boring. And half the people will be going to a new place, and they'll be thinking, God, how exciting, how thrilling, so much to see, etc., etc. And of course, the place that they're going to is exactly the same. What's different is the mindset. And this idea of the huge role that a mindset can play attracted the attention of a very very little-known figure in French literature called Xavier de Maistre, who, at the end of the 18th century, wrote a very odd little book called Journey Around My Bedroom. And the idea of Journey Around My Bedroom was, it was a sort of anti-travel book. In de Maistre's day, rather like ours, travel was beginning to always be associated with the extraordinary, the far away, etc. And this really annoyed de Maistre, and he decided that he was going to describe a journey around his bedroom, and that this could be as fascinating as a journey to the Himalayas or to the South Seas. And there was a kind of polemical edge to this. His book was a big bestseller, actually, and he followed it up with a book called Nocturnal Journey to the Windowsill, in which he described a journey to his windowsill. I'm not joking, this is actually true. Unfortunately, the book isn't that good. It's not as good as it might be. I think the idea is lovely, but I think it is a very sort of inspiring idea, because most of our time is, of course, spent in our own locations, and there can be a real prejudice against the everyday that's formed by habit and our sense that a place can't be interesting. It's rather like, I guess, like many things. If the feeling of what our response should be to a place hugely colours what we actually end up feeling. So our feeling that it's not very interesting to walk to work has a huge effect in actually making that walk to work not very interesting. So that, I think, is a very valuable point to bear in mind as we travel. I discovered that Nietzsche was quite interested in de Maistre and knew all about him. And there's one passage that I came across in Nietzsche where he describes really the way in which there are some people who've had extraordinary lives and they've seen all kinds of things, and yet you ask them, what their lives were like, and they just can't really say. They seem to have been these great experiences have sort of washed over them. And there are other people who have maybe had outwardly quite ordinary lives and yet have been able to make an awful lot out of their experiences. And that seems really to be the point at the heart of de Maistre's own writing. Let me just read you the quote, what Nietzsche says about this. He says, "When we observe how some people know how to manage their experiences, their insignificant, everyday experiences, so that they become an arable soil that bears fruit 3 times a year, while others, and how many there are driven through surging waves of destiny, the most multifarious currents of the times and the nations, and yet always remain on top, bobbing like a cork, then we're in the end tempted to divide mankind into a minority of those who know how to make much of little, and a majority of those who know how to make little of much." And I go on to say that we meet people who've crossed deserts, floated on ice caps, and cut their way through jungles, and yet in whose souls we would search in vain for evidence of what they've witnessed. Dressed in a pair of pink and blue pyjamas, satisfied within the confines of his own bedroom, Xavier de Maistre was gently nudging us to try, before taking off for distant hemispheres, to notice what we've already seen. And that seems to be a sort of really a major theme of the book, this idea of the sort of how can we change not just the places we visit, but the way that we look at the places that we visit. Probably I should stop it there, but what can I say? Thank you all very much for coming, and we do have time for questions and thoughts and reflections, so do feel free to have a say, and but thank you all very much. Yeah.
I thought we were more and more pressured with it every day to feel inadequate. It seems like it seems like we're bombarded all the time to think we're kind of dull. Advertising sort of says that unless you're Jamie Oliver and you've got 10 friends on a moped,
Yeah.
And you're listening to this music, do you
Yeah.
think there's more and more pressure to feel that we're
I think there's a real
inadequate?
tension. I think there's a real tension in society that comes from the way that we live at once in a kind of meritocracy, which has a real sense of a hierarchy, and also in a democracy where everyone is supposed to be equal. And I think these things, and everyone is supposed to have a value, this very much sort of Christian-inspired sense. And I think these two thoughts are always in tension, and you see them, and they're sort of in a constant struggle. So no sooner have we had an exhibition like the one upstairs saying, actually there is value in the everyday, that's then challenged by other things, and the Mario Testino view of the high life, or whatever it happens to be. And I think it's a constant, perhaps a fruitful tension, but I think I think the emphasis, what does tend to get lost on the whole is, of course, the domestic and the everyday, which is why, I think it's the very fact that we see that it's a point, that there's a point to be made in saying everyday life is interesting or the domestic is interesting, suggests that we're often on the verge of losing sight of that because of other pressures. Yeah. Yeah. How do I see... Oh, yes, sorry. The question was, how do I see photography and the role, I think, the role of photography, especially in regards to travel and the everyday. I mean, of course, the great sort of achievement of photography has been to, I mean, for me, I don't know, it's very, many achievements of photography, but for me, what I like in photography is the capacity at once to, you know, to make the everyday new, and that kind of, you know, the very act of framing a very ordinary scene can lead us to view it in a different way. And so, you know, I like so many other people, you know, I like ordinary landscapes, the landscapes of, you know, the ordinary built environment, like the pictures upstairs. You know, I think there's a way, there's a picture upstairs of a woman reading a book on a train. An immensely powerful image, I think. We've all been on that train, etc. But we've been sort of alone with that experience. We perhaps haven't noticed that experience is capable of being seen in an aesthetic way. And I think what seeing that picture does is almost give us license to see the beauty of it, because, you know, it's quite odd to find a journey on a sort of modern plastic train quite attractive. It's generally, we still have very, very sort of classical ideas of what is attractive, and photography, I think, can really challenge that and does that very well. So that's my view of photography. Doesn't really answer the question, but yeah. Yeah.
On the theme of photography, I think it's when we were taking these photographs on the trip, it was very much an unknown what was going to come out of it, and as you say, the fact that everybody has been on this on a train or in a similar situation, kind of, and the fact that a picture like that isn't kind of immortalizes this particular situation and lets one reinterpret it, reevaluate it.
Right.
Is exactly what gives photography a communicative power.
Sure.
That other media don't have.
Sure.
So
and it's very sort of touching quality, because I guess it makes us think of the number of times that we've been alone with that scene. I mean, I think, you know, one of the many functions of art is to get us to feel less alone with experiences which are important to us but are not generally discussed. You know, I think one of the reasons why people turn to art is because they find there certain things which are not current in other kinds of sort of discourse. And I think what photography can do is to get us to feel that there's someone with us in certain kinds of experience. It almost encourages us to take certain of our feelings seriously. You know, if you see in a photographic exhibition a clearly sort of aesthetic rendering of someone reading a book on a train, that's going to give you almost a kind of confidence to find that attractive, I think. And that does seem important.
How would you envisage a new kind of travel agent?
A new kind of travel agent. Yeah, I'd love to start a new kind of travel agency. In fact, I had a visit from a Dutch man just the other day who said that he'd started a travel agency in Holland, which was dedicated to getting people to see everyday life in Holland. And so he says that he's got this thing whereby he gets quite wealthy tourists from America and elsewhere, and he gets them to, he gives them projects. He gives them projects to do, like, he'll give them a certain very limited amount of money, and he'll say, survive on this till tomorrow. And apparently this is an absolutely huge success. He'll also take them into factories to have meals with ordinary people, etc., etc. I mean, in a way, it's childishly simple, but I think very, very interesting. And I'd love someone to start that here and If anyone wants to do that, we can talk about that later. No, I think it's a wonderful idea. That would be my sense of what a travel agency should be. And generally probably shouldn't send you very far away. Yeah. 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 Yes. Right, sure. I mean, like in so many other things that have a sort of practical purpose and a genuine purpose, there's also a kind of status purpose behind traveling, and things can get very confused in that way. So, you know, you're doing it to get one up on the neighbours. Yeah, yeah. Right, sure, exactly. I mean, it would be very bizarre. I mean, you know, people often say, you know, where are you going? Where are you spending your summer? And if you say, I'm just going to spend my time at home, that would seem rather strange. People would think, oh God, I didn't know they were that poor, or, you know, etc. And it's really not allowed. Yeah. Yeah.
I think you talked about the contradiction of being going on holiday and wanting first to do nothing and to do everything.
Yeah.
And how everyone gets it wrong.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. It's like, and you've got to set up two travel agents.
Yes. I mean, I don't know. I think Flaubert says at one point that a well-educated person only needs to know 5 books well, and I don't know whether a good architect only needs to know 5 buildings well, probably. But I do think that on the whole, traveling incites us to see too much. And because it's possible to do everything. I mean, I'm constantly coming across people who say, you know, I've got 10 days of holiday, I'm going to go to India. And you just think, really, why? You know, I mean, are you sure? You know, and there's this constant urge for more rather than for deepening experiences. So I'm all for less experiences but deeper ones. But, yeah.
You talk about the anticipation travel and the relative travel. You can use it which you attribute to not spending enough conscious time actually thinking about your destination or the place where you're going. Do you also make an argument that we have too much time to think about the destination? And usually several weeks or months until I actually decide to go and prepare departure. We have this time to build this vision and so forth to this point.
Yeah.
Then we can ask if you consider the opposite when you have impromptu weekends away or holiday which is so strong on you by usually more appreciative of the holiday. Is that because there's less time to actually consider?
I don't know whether that's actually true. I was once taken on a surprise trip to Paris and got highly unnerved as I was on the Eurostar. I didn't even know whether I was going to Brussels, and I didn't know where I was going. And really it cut me off from a very important source of pleasure, which is the pleasure of anticipation. And, you know, whatever the truth value of anticipation, I mean, you know, one could say, as this man in this Huysmans novel says, that actually the pleasure of anticipation is as legitimate as the pleasure of actually being in a place. So, you know, I think one needs to move away from this idea that the being is the real thing and the anticipation is the false thing. It has its own reality. And in a way, why not concentrate on the anticipation if that's a source of pleasure? I mean, another kind of travel agent would encourage you to book a ticket, would take your money, etc. You have to book, let's say, 6 months before, and then just before you're going to go, it would impound your passport and take away the ticket and destroy it, and then give you back your money, and maybe with a commission. And that might actually be a wonderful way of travelling. We've just got time, I think, for a few more questions, don't we? Actually, you've already had a question, so let's just see if anyone else. Yeah.
Well, this idea of taking a holiday around your own home,
Yeah.
it seems to me that the Japanese photograph were going and travelling around the world and actually staying in Japan.
Yes.
What's your idea of the theme park?
I mean, I guess the theme park is really picking up on the idea that you don't need very much to make you dream. You know, you don't need the whole of Holland in order to start thinking of Holland. I mean, I guess one could say to the theme park people is, you know, do you even need 8 buildings of Holland? Maybe all you need is a book about Holland, a picture of Holland, a postcard of Holland, etc. So, but I think it is picking up on that undoubtedly true idea that you don't need the whole thing. As I said, just like you don't need to know a person before you could imagine falling in love with them, marrying them, and being happy forever. And of course, just as in travel, it gets harder to imagine that you could do all of those things once you're actually there, as it were. Other questions? Yeah. Well, I do travel a lot less than most people that I know. I do like being at home. I mean, no, not really. And the sort of secret ideology behind this, and I can say this in this context, I think, because everyone's here is an artist in a way, but maybe. But I think artists are generally always on holiday in that sense, because and that doesn't mean that they're being lazy, but they've always got their senses alert. And there's quite a lot of literature which I'm quite sympathetic to that basically says that the whole concept of holiday is a very cruel plot by the bourgeoisie to the whole idea of a division between play and fun and work is a very cruel one, and it reflects the fact that most people don't enjoy their jobs. As soon as you enjoy your job, you're permanently on holiday, in a way. And I think that most artists do, even though they hate them in a way, do also, in a way, love their jobs. And so they're always being receptive, and they're always working. Novelists, for example, they're always working in the bedroom, in dinner party, etc. They're always at work. I presume architects are also always at work, always looking, always trying to get inspiration. They can't help but respond to certain materials, certain shapes, etc. So, yeah, that's my answer. Yeah.
But if you travel, if you plan to travel, do you have a sort of a method which you will take up on to explore the other places?
I mean, I think I've been sort of discussing some of the methods, or at least hinting at them. I mean, I think it's got to do with knowing what you want to see. It's getting a sense of your own curiosity, your own resources, where something can slot in. I mean, we all know, for example, that comparison is a very useful way of appreciating something. It's when you've compared two churches in Venice that you're able to see what's special about one, or what's the identity of one starts to become clear once you also know the other. So it's very good to have something to compare one's experiences to, some kind of reference point. Very often we don't have that, so that's something to to build up. I mean, this works classically with architecture, that it's because you know one building by Le Corbusier that you can appreciate other qualities in another building by Le Corbusier. It's the two really go together. So a lot of traveling, I think successful traveling is having the other one, having that other thing to relate what you're seeing to. So that's one idea. Yeah. I mean, I think the great advantage of sort of working holidays in that sense is that, again, they're very alive to the way that doing nothing isn't very interesting. That relaxation is definitely one mode. We have to relax every night for 8 hours or whatever. So it's definitely one mode that we're in. But actually, on the whole, relaxation is only one of the things that makes us happy. And it tends. You don't need that much relaxing time to feel all right, to feel relaxed enough. And then other desires to promote goodness, to reflect beauty, to create something, whatever it happens to be, kick in. And I think that an active holiday is picking up on that. Yeah. Probably I should stop it there. But thank you all very, very much for coming. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.